Sometimes what people think they see in a case becomes a story everyone believes afterward. Did the shadow reveal the truth? Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Stina Raven, and I look at the patterns behind true crime cases and the narratives that form around them. One of the most debated moments in the Chris Watts case is something people call the shadow video in the neighbor's surveillance footage from that morning. There is a moment where a small shadow appears to move toward Chris Watts near the truck. Some viewers believe that shadow could show one of the girls walking toward him before the truck leaves. And actually, they think it shows that Chris Watts bent down and picked up something and put it in the truck. That's how detailed it got in pattern recognition. But the footage itself is extremely ambiguous. When footage is ambiguous, our brains naturally try to recognize patterns. It is the same reason someone can point to a cloud and say, "That looks like a dog." Once they see it, you start seeing it too. Security cameras at night can also create unusual shadow effects from streetlights, headlights, and motion artifacts. So the shadow itself isn't definitive proof of anything. But the more interesting question may not be what the shadow shows, it's what happened afterward. Months later, during his prison interview, Chris Watts told a different version of events, one where the girls were alive before the truck left the driveway. By that point, the case had already become one of the most widely discussed true crime stories online. People were analyzing the neighbor's surveillance footage, frame by frame, and debating what the shadow might show. By the time of that prison interview, Chris Watts had already been in prison for months. During that time, he was receiving information from outside the prison, through his lawyer, through family members, and through friends who were following the case. He was also receiving many, like thousands or millions of, I can only say fan mail, at the prison itself. So God knows what they were telling him in these letters as well. So those letters plus his family and his lawyer were telling him what people were saying about the case online and in the media. There is no indication that anyone specifically mentioned the shadow footage to him. But by that point, the case had become one of the most widely discussed true crime stories online. People were analyzing the neighbor's surveillance footage frame by frame and debating what the shadow might show. So when Watts spoke to investigators months later, he wasn't speaking in the same informational environment as the original interrogation. He already knew how people were interpreting parts of the case. For many people, his later confessions seemed to match what they believed they saw in the shadow footage. And once those two things line up, a visual interpretation and a confession, the story can start to feel settled. But there's another possibility worth considering. Earlier in the case, we already saw Chris Watts change his story in response to suggestions. During the interrogation, when investigators proposed the idea that Shanann may have harmed the girls, Watts not only quickly adopted that explanation, but he also added his own details to it. Details the investigators had never suggested. So, when his later confession included details that seemed to match a theory people were already discussing, it raises an interesting question. Did the shadow reveal what really happened? Or did the narrative evolve after people began interpreting the footage that way? When evidence is ambiguous, interpretation fills the gaps. And sometimes the order of events matter more than the details themselves. Because once the story feels like it fits, the mind often stops looking for alternatives. So I'm curious, what do you think? When you watch the shadow footage, do you think it actually shows one of the girls walking toward Chris? Or do you think people may be seeing something that isn't really there? Let me know in the comments. See you next time.